Hello everyone and welcome to another Tech Thursday. Today's topic is going to be about rendering tips and tricks. I've seen a couple comments out on the Facebook group about how to create those realistic renderings, and so I'm going to show you some tips and tricks that I've put together on creating the realistic looking type renderings that you might want. So because rendering takes a lot of time, this is going to be a little bit of a live demo and a PowerPoint presentation. But I'm going to include the PowerPoint presentation as a PDF after this recording, so look for it in the description. That way you can reference it at a later time. Okay, so let's dive right in. I'm going to start out by just showing some renderings, and these are actually all created, like modeled and created and rendered inside of Fusion. And I'm going to reference a couple of these as we go through. So take a look at some of the renderings here. For example, this drum set, we're going to learn about the depth of field. You'll notice the symbols in the background are kind of blurry, where your eye is drawn to this particular drum right here. And again, that's one of the tips we'll learn about is depth of field. Take a look at this Tesla rendering. You'll actually, by the end of today's session, you'll recognize this background, but notice the reflections on the surfaces and stuff, and the highlights, etc. I really like this rendering mainly because it's basically one light coming from the top, and you'll see the fall off happening, so you can see the textured ground, but then it just disappears to black. So it really emphasizes the actual object itself. And then even custom materials. So this is kind of a chalk or a chalky type material. There's no color or anything to this, but it really brings out the detail, the contrast of, like, for example, all the hoses and the chain and the tread, etc. And then here's a product design. So this person created a snorkel. And the thing that I found interesting on this rendering is notice the color of the background. And again, we're going to learn about different environments and background colors, etc. So typically you see a white or a black background, but this time they chose kind of this, slight tan to orange color. But again, it kind of emphasizes the object. Notice the reflections and the refractions and the plastics. I just think this is a pretty cool image. Okay, so I'm going to go through my slide deck and then show some live examples, but I have about 8 or 9 tips that I want to share with you. And then probably the number one tip is to not use sharp edges. And so, for example, sitting where you're at right now, kind of look around. Look at your monitor, look at your keyboard, etc. Even objects you might have, just sitting on your desk or whatever. Take a look at them and notice. I mean, this can be kind of hard to see, but like, for example, this line right here, you can see how the light is refracting right off of that edge. You can see how it's highlighting on there, and we're going to talk about that. And that's because not hardly anything has sharp edges. So, for example, look at your monitor, look at your desk, look at your computer, and notice how the light reflects off of those curved or angled surfaces. And that's what I was just showing with this GoPro mount that I had sitting on my desk. And in this image right here, you can see a prime example of this, where on the left I just have some dice that I created. On the left is very sharp edges. On the right, I just added some slight fillets or blends to the edges. And notice how much more realistic this looks. In fact, probably the most important one is right here along the bottom. By having those fillets on the bottom, it creates a little bit of a shadow, a little bit of an indent, and it actually looks like this dice is sitting on the table, where this one almost looks like it's coming up through the table or whatever it's sitting on. Also notice how the light reflects off of these filleted edges. In fact, here's more of a close-up view of it. You can kind of see even the little pips, the black dots on the dice. There's some very small fillets on there. Now, with that said, I'm not saying blend or fillet every single edge of all of your parts, because that will bog down your computer. So what I typically do is I set up my scene. I get my camera the way I want. I get my lights kind of the way I want. I kind of see, okay, this is how I want to render it. And then I can visually see which edges are in view and which edges aren't in view. So I can be very selective and say, I only want to fillet these 20, 30, 40 fillets or edges on the front, and I'll just ignore the ones in the back. Okay, so here's another example. Here's a rendering that I did. Just kind of shows how light reflects off of curved surfaces. It just makes it look more realistic. You can kind of see all these curved surfaces have these refractions and reflections and stuff. Okay, the second tip I like to share, and not a lot of people know about this, is that you can limit the resolution or the quality in your render. Okay, and this is a great way to quickly see which direction your lights are casting from, how your shadows will look, do you see reflections, what's the colors of your lights, etc. And it takes a huge amount of time away from confirming your final render. So let me show you what I mean by this. So I'm going to jump into Fusion really quick, and I'm going to switch into my render workspace. So now we can see I'm in my render workspace, and again, I'm just kind of using these dice as examples. Now you'll notice I have this kind of stage or background. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. So I'm going to zoom up a little bit. And I'm going to do what's called an in-canvas render. We actually have 3 different kinds of renders. So we have what's called in-canvas, where it actually renders right here on my screen. And then we also have this teapot, where it allows you to render on the cloud or locally on your computer. So I'm going to work with this one right here. And I'm just going to click on this in-canvas render. And you'll notice I'm pixelated. So it's actually calculating all of the light photons for every single pixel. And the longer we wait, the nicer result we're going to get. But you can see that it's quite slow because it's calculating shadows, reflections, refractions, etc. And we're going to sit here for quite a few minutes to wait to see what this thing's going to look like. You know, typically you want to get into, you know, the higher iterations like 100 to 200, and we're only at iteration 12 right now. Okay, that's going to take quite some time. So if you click on this little gear icon, this allows you to limit the resolution, and I do this all the time. So you can see, crank it all the way down to 20. I'm just going to crank this down and watch what happens now. You'll notice that my pixels are larger, so it's a coarser representation, but we're already at iteration 70, almost to 100 already. Whereas previously it took a long time. And I can kind of visually see what is my scene going to look like. I can see that there's some shadows casting back here. I can see that, you know, it's illuminated well enough, but I can even come in and change this. So for example, it's still rendering right now. Let's bring the brightness down a little bit and let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to crank this down maybe to 500. And I can visually see that that's kind of dark. Okay, let's go maybe up to 3,000, and we can see that that's way too bright in this example. So a really quick way to kind of see what results would work best. So let's try 1500 for my light, and that looks pretty good. Maybe I want to change the location of my light, and I'm going to cover this more in depth a little bit later, but I'm actually rotating where my light is casting from, so you can kind of see my shadows are moving around. So let's just make the shadows kind of cast toward us a little bit, and I can visually see what that's going to look like. Okay, so again, that was under this little gear icon, limit resolution, and you don't have to go all the way down to 20. You could go up, you know, in the 50s or whatever. Right here's around 40, and you can see it's rendering a little bit nicer, but again, a little bit slower. But it's not taking as long as if it were all the way set to 100%. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my render. Let's jump back into the presentation here. My other tip is to add dirt, smudges, scratches, textures, etc. to your parts. Most objects are not perfectly clean or smooth. You can add a little bit of realism to your parts or whatever by adding like scratches or dents or dings, for example. You know, take a look at your mouse. Does it have fingerprints on it? Is it worn off in certain areas because you've used it so much? Same thing with like maybe your water bottle. Has it been dropped and there's a little nick, you know, on the plastic or whatever? You can, you know, simulate that in your renderings, and it's actually going to make it look a little bit more realistic. So for example, here's a close-up of the dice, and you'll notice that how the light is reflecting off of this front edge right here. It's kind of broken up, and that's because there's a little bit of a texture on here. Now, in a lot of these images that I'm sharing, I've kind of overemphasized the colors of the lights and the depth of the texture so you can kind of really see what's going on. But in reality, I might crank it down just a little bit so there's just a slight texture, not a really heavy texture like you see in some of these images. So keep that in mind. So we can see, for example, how the light's reflecting off of this texture, and it looks pretty nice. Another thing, I don't know if you noticed, but notice the smudge. It's kind of a darker color over here on the left, where maybe somebody had dirty fingers. And a dice is something that gets held and thrown and abused quite a bit, honestly, right? So you want to kind of simulate that in your rendering. Okay. So hopefully you all recognize this image. This is actually from the original Toy Story movie from, I think it's from the late 80s, early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And some interesting things going on in this image. First of all, notice the background is slightly blurry. Again, that's that depth of field that we were talking about earlier. And we're going to talk about more in depth later, no pun intended. But it really brings your eyes to kind of focus on the main characters, and that's what they really want you to do. But let's take a closer look. Notice the floor. So there's dings and scratches and dents on the floor. Okay, also notice the texture on the dog. There's a little bit of texture on his chest right here. It kind of makes him look a little bit worn, a little bit used, for example. Same thing with the penguin. Notice the white paint has some scratches on it right here. And has some, you know, it's been worn. It's been played with quite a bit. Okay. Now taking a look, zooming back, did you notice the scratches? Did you notice the dings or anything like that? Not really. But it kind of adds a little bit more realism. It's showing that, you know, stuff has been dropped on this floor. You know, it's been played with or whatever. Same thing with texture. Obviously, Mr. Potato Head, they want you to think that he looks like a potato, so they added a texture to his skin. Whereas some of his other parts, like the nose and the mustache and the ears, are kind of like a smooth plastic. They don't have any texture. Okay, but you can add a little bit of realism by adding texture. And again, notice how the light is reflecting and refracting off of the skin texture versus the really sharp highlights like on his nose, for example. Okay. And then for this character, this is the emphasizing the no sharp edges. Notice that pretty much every single edge on this character is reflecting light. So even like this thumb wheel, you know, right across the top of his head right here, even his feet, notice there's some highlights right along his feet right here. But also notice the dirt on his feet because they're always touching the floor. it makes sense that these would probably be dirty. Okay, so again, adding just that little tiny bit of realism makes the part, or makes the character, more realistic. Okay, so how do you add these smudges, these scratches, the dirt, rust, etc.? Well, I found the easiest way is to add them as a decal. And I'm going to go through live and show you how to do this. But basically what you want to do is search, whichever, I use Google, but you can use Yahoo or whatever, for an image of smudges or scratches, etc. But the key thing is that you want to make sure that you select a transparent background. And I'm going to show this in just a moment. Then you can add the decal, and then you'll want to change the opacity to a pretty small number. So by default it's going to be 100, but we don't want it to be that, emphasized, so we're going to bring it down probably below 20, in fact maybe even in the single digits. Okay? But the neat thing about this is you can add multiple decals to a face if necessary. So let's show this live. I'm going to jump back into Fusion, and let's just kind of zoom up on this dice right here. And I'm going to go out to, I'm going to use Google in this case. Let me bring it over to the correct monitor. And let's just do a search for scratches texture. Okay. Then what you'll want to do is click on images. And it's going to show a whole bunch of images with scratches on it. But the important thing is we want to make sure that they're transparent. And the reason for that is, for example, this one I'm hovering over right now, it has some texture to it, but if we were to put this on top of our dice, it would almost be like a sticker. You wouldn't be able to see through it. Okay? So we want to make sure it's a transparent background. Unfortunately, this little icon here does not always work that way, so here's the trick. Go to Tools, and then to Color, and then to Transparent. And you'll notice that the screen will update. Now it's showing a bunch of different kinds, okay? But if I click, for example, on this one here, notice the little grid in the background. This is kind of proving that this is a transparent background. In fact, let's go ahead and use this one. So I'm going to save this image. Let me just do it in my downloads, and we'll just call this Scratch. I'll call it Scratchy. Okay? So I just downloaded that image onto my computer. This little icon right here is the decal icon. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And it says select a face. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this face right here. Select an image. Well, we'll just go into my downloads and I can do a search for it. But it's right there. So I'm going to go ahead and say Scratchy. I'll open this up and you can see that it's now on that face, and I can drag this around. Okay. Now here's a couple tips and tricks with this. If I move it up onto this other face, you can see that it's actually wrapping onto that other face, but I'm getting some weird results, okay? And that's because there's a lot of curved surfaces, there's a lot of fillets, etc. Okay? So we'll probably want to turn off chain faces. And what that means is now it's going to be stuck to just this face that I selected on, and now you'll notice it's not wrapping into those little black dots. It's not wrapping onto the other surface or anything like that. So, okay. I noticed some people are complaining about lag. Hopefully the audio is synced up. I do see that, yeah, stream status is bad, so hopefully that's not going to interfere with us too much. I'll keep going. Hopefully we're okay. So the next thing I want to do is crank my opacity down a little bit. So I'm going to crank this down, and you can see around like 48 to 50, it's a little bit harder to see the image. And it's hard to highlight because it keeps highlighting the face, but I've cranked that down. I can go even further, and you'll see the further we go, the lighter it gets. And this is what I was talking about. You'll want to bring this down to a pretty small number. Okay. I typically leave it 100% and I get it placed where I want it. I get it scaled the way I want. So I want it to kind of scratch this whole face, for example. Maybe we rotate this around or something like that, for example. Okay. And then I'll bring my opacity down. And again, I'm going to leave it at a kind of a high number so you can see what's going on, but I would probably bring that down to, you know, 8 to 5, something like that. Okay. So there you go. You can kind of see that we've now put that decal of those scratches on that face. And the other thing I mentioned is that you can add multiple decals. So let's do this again. I'm going to go out to Google. And this time I'm going to do a search for, let's just do a search for rust. I'll say rust texture. Again, making sure my tools transparent is turned on. And now we can see that we have a bunch of different kind of rust textures that we could use. So I like this. This one's kind of cool. Kind of looks like, you know, dripping water or whatever. So we'll go ahead and, again, you can kind of see the grid background. I'll save that. And I'll call it Rusty. Okay. And again, you can do pretty much anything. So you can do like brick texture or whatever, and you're gonna find brick. It can be you know, road texture or whatever. You'll get a bunch of different examples out there. So pretty useful. Okay, so I downloaded that Rust. Let's go ahead and say decal. Select the face again. I'm going to turn off chain faces. Select the image. So let's do the Rusty image. I'll position it kind of where I want. Let's just maybe put it along this top edge. Maybe we'll scale it so it's a little bit wider, and maybe scale it so it's a little bit taller. Just something like this, okay? Just so it looks like it's kind of dripping down. And I'll crank the opacity down quite a bit, okay? And again, you can kind of see, if I kind of rotate it around, you can see that slight rusty texture with the scratches on it and stuff. So I find that the decal is probably the easiest way of doing this. And if I come over to this other dice, let me zoom in a little bit, you're gonna see I've got some texture on the dice. In fact, I apologize for the flashing, but if you kind of look where my cursor is right now, you'll see some bumpy texture on the dice. We can obviously see some scratches on the dice. And then if I zoom out, you'll even see some like fingerprints or whatever. You can kind of see these smudge marks, which I really can't highlight. But close up, they're pretty obvious, but far away, it just looks like a more realistic dice. It's been used and abused. Okay, let's jump back to our presentation here. My next example, or my next tip, is to create a realistic environment. Don't just use the default lights. You can if you want to, but you'll find that after using them for a while, they're not quite exactly what you want. Also, create an environment for your object. For example, if it's a food processor or a coffee machine or a toaster, put it in a kitchen, for example. Okay, if it's maybe it's like a wrench or some kind of a power tool, maybe have it on a garage floor or on some you know, diamond plate metal or something like that, just to give it a little bit more realism. Also, I recommend using HDRI lighting if possible, and to try and do depth of field. And again, I'm going to talk about all of these. So here's a prime example. Here's a food processor that was rendered inside of Fusion, and it looks pretty good, right? I mean, we can tell it's a food processor. It's got some decals on it and all that kind of stuff, a little bit of a reflection. But if we put it in a kitchen, sitting on a counter, with a kitchen background, and you can see even the lights are reflecting on the plastic and stuff. It just looks more realistic. So kind of plain and boring. And then this one, I think more realistic. In fact, this isn't my favorite rendering because the background's just a little bit more blurry than I wanted it to be. But you can see how the plastic, the clear plastic looks much more realistic. And, you can see the highlights on the plastic, like on the switch. We have the nice reflection on the counter. You just know that this is a kitchen product. And that's what we're trying basically to sell the viewer. Okay. So how do you create a realistic environment? Well, there's a couple different ways. So the first way is just to use a solid color background. And again, I'm using the dice as an example. And I just did a kind of a medium gray background. Or you can use the environment background. And it's kind of hard to see the difference there, but I'm going to toggle back and forth. But you can see the environment background looks a little bit nicer because it's got some darker grays up here and some lighter grays over here. So let me show you the example of this, okay? I'm going to turn off my background here. And if I go into my scene settings, you'll see the background right here is set to solid color. And I can change that color to be whatever I want. So if I came into more of a gray, you can kind of see there's the gray. And remember that snorkel that I showed earlier that kind of had a tan orange background? That's kind of why I included that rendering, is they did something like this where they picked a particular color and used that as the background. Now it's a solid color. You can kind of see there's no gradation or anything like that. So your other option is to change, I'm going to switch back to kind of a light gray here, is to change from solid color to environment. And you'll notice my background changed quite a bit. If I rotate around, we're actually going to see what's going on. Here's the actual light that's being cast into my scene. So we can see it's kind of a warm light. It's got some yellow to it. If I keep rotating around, we can see kind of a panel, like a grid panel light casting onto the scene. And if I keep rotating around, there's another panel light on the other side. And finally we come back to this soft light. So you can actually use this background as your environment. So notice I'm going to kind of zoom up on my dice right here. It's dark up here. It's light down here. And if I were to hit render, we're going to do a pretty fast render. You can see it's actually rendering that background in your scene. So there's pros and cons with this. You'd have to orient your objects to be in the correct location so you don't get these weird, for example, I don't like the dark, harsh line going through there. So let's kind of keep rotating around. And this looks a little bit better. So I've got kind of that softer gradation going on right here. But now my dice are on the back, right? I'm not as excited about that. So I'd have to rotate my dice around. So again, be careful using the environment background because it will actually render, like you see here, the environment. Okay. The next option is to actually model your own background. So in this example, I did a sharp edge. I just basically created a wall and a floor with a sharp edge. And you'll notice when I render, it actually looks pretty cool, I think. I'm getting some color refraction off of the background. The dice look a little bit warmer than in, here, not as warm. It's kind of a gray background. But here you can kind of see a little bit more of the tan colors are reflecting on there. I can actually see a shadow going on in the background, whereas these you can kind of see they're on the floor, the shadows on the floor. But here it's actually being cast on the wall. And maybe that's what I want, maybe it's not. However, I see kind of a sharpish edge kind of cutting through my view. So another way to do that is to use a smooth edge. And you can almost think of this as like a photographer's backdrop. You know, if you've ever had your picture taken with the family and they put like some fabric behind you and it kind of flows onto the floor, it's to minimize those sharp edges or those harsh edges. So exact same camera angle, exact same lighting, but kind of notice the background. You still see a little bit of the floor is a little bit darker, but then the wall is a little bit lighter. We get some refraction going on. I just think it looks kind of cool, a little bit nicer. And again, depending on the size you make that smooth edge, you'll get different results. Okay, so let's take a look at that really quick. I actually modeled a smooth edge background. Okay, so when I zoom up here, we can see the harsh edge of the floor, but then it transitions into the wall, for example. So I can come in here. Let's just do a quick in-canvas render, and we'll see. We get just nice smooth transitions. Okay, I got a little bit of light reflection coming over here from one of my lights. So just kind of I think it's a neat way. Okay. My next tip is to create your own lights. Okay, give me just a second here. Hopefully we're not delayed. Let me go back to my screen. So creating your own lights. This is really useful because this allows you to really specify where you want the lights to come from. So for example, I'm just looking in my room right here. I've got, you can't really see them, but I've got a row of lights across the top. And one of them is casting down over here. One of them is casting over on this wall, and you can't really see it very well. But I want to be able to control where that light is coming from. Instead of just having one light in the middle of the room, which is kind of what your default lights do, you can be very specific. And that's why I showed that rendering at the beginning of that cool little tank with the really black background. They turned off all the lights and had just a single light kind of emphasizing the model. But if it was only coming from the top, you probably wouldn't be able to see some of the details in there. So he probably created some lights from the side, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, I've found that creating your own lights is actually fairly easy to do. All you have to do is create some geometry that has an emissive material. Okay, and I've been using the LED emissive material because I find it to be the most obvious, I guess is the right word. And then I also say turn the ambient light to 0 to see the full effect. So for example, here's a standard rendering, probably cool light inside of Fusion. Oops, wrong button, sorry. But here I've added a panel that's casting a yellow light. And notice the rendering now. And in fact, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. So here's your standard render. And then here I've added kind of this yellow light. You can see how it's casting on the background, but more importantly, notice how it's casting on this dice right here, which in turn is being reflected into this dice over here. So again, let's go back. You don't see that highlight. And here you do. And again, this is a very mild example, but it does add more realism to your renderings. This is a kind of washed out. And here you can see that this dice is starting to get a little bit warmer, a little bit more light cast onto it. Now here I've added kind of a bluish purple light farther away casting toward the dice. And we can see we're still seeing the yellow light, but now there's more of a blue tint to these front faces here. And to me, it's making it look more like realistic ivory. Okay, so back here, it's kind of yellow or greenish. And here we've added a little bit of blue to that. We still have the yellow on the side of the dice, a little bit more blue. And it's just, to me, adding more realism to the dice. You can also create target lights, which are kind of like what I would say like a flashlight, for example, or a spotlight. So you could create, for example, like a cylinder, and you'll apply the material to the end face. And that's key. You want to make sure we apply it to the end face. If we did it to the whole object, it would cast light in all directions. We only want it to be projected from the end. So notice in this example, I've got two lights. This one here is a blue light, and you can even see the reflection, or the fall off of it on the floor right here. But how it's really kind of emphasizing and highlighting this front face, where it's not really highlighting the side face, because we're really focusing on the front. It's also creating a much sharper shadow. Instead of a soft shadow like we see here, it's creating a much sharper shadow, which you would see with a flashlight, for example. Okay. And then finally, you can create an omnidirectional light using like a sphere. So this would be like a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and it's casting light in all directions. And again, notice how it really kind of illuminates the scene. It's illuminating all of the faces. You still see a shadow from it, but it's a little bit softer. It's not quite so harsh. Now, the question I get asked a lot is, well, you can see your lights in the scene. And yes, I purposely put them here so you could see what we're doing. But in reality, you would not want to see these lights in your scene. So I'm going to show you how we go about doing this. So let me jump back into Fusion. Okay, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can kind of see what's going on. And I've already created some of these panel lights. So I'm going to turn on this panel light 2. And all it is a cube, or in this case, a rectangle. Okay. Let me go ahead and close this guy out. We'll go into our appearances. Oops. Turn on panel light 2. And I mentioned using an emissive material. So let me go ahead and drag this open a little bit. I have a lot of stuff I was working on. So under Other, there's a folder here called Emissive. So I'm going to say Emissive, and you can see that we have a bunch of different displays, and it looks like they've actually moved some of these around. So there's your LCDs. You can do different segments, etc. So they just updated it, so it should have been under there. Let's see, under miscellaneous, emissive, there we go. So it's now under, instead of other, it's under miscellaneous, emissive. And you can see we have different options in here. So I'm going to do this green LED. So I'm just going to drag and drop my green LED onto that rectangle there. Okay. If I were to render right now, we wouldn't really be able to see what's going on. So one of my tips was to turn the ambient light to 0. So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to click on our scene settings, and right here, I'm going to crank this all the way down to 0. And you'll notice that pretty much everything goes away except for this LED light. And if I were to hit render right now, all we see is this is emitting a little bit of light. We can't see our dice or anything like that. It's still rendering, but we really can't see what's going on. So, because it's still rendering, let's go ahead and edit our LED light. I'm going to move this over a little bit. I guess I can't. Let me move my whole scene over. Let's go ahead and edit this guy. And right here it says luminance, and you can see it's a really low number. It's set to 100. Well, I'm going to start cranking this up a little bit, and instantly we can see the result. Okay, and I think this is really cool. So obviously we're in a very high number here, but you can see how this is casting light in multiple directions, but it's really emphasizing our dice now, and you can see the shadow and everything like that. So let's crank this back down a little bit. Let's try 1000 lumens. Oops. So there's 1000 lumens. So it's now emitting some light. It's almost like a glow stick, right? But not quite enough. So let's go to 10,000 lumens. And now I'm starting to kind of get the result that I want. It's casting some green light onto the side of my dice here. And so this is the exact reason I talk about turning your ambient light to 0, is so you can see what's going on. Okay? Hopefully this is making sense. I'll go ahead and turn on another panel light. Let's go ahead and turn on this blue panel light. And we can see that it's obviously casting a very strong blue light in this case. Okay. And I could edit that. Let me go ahead and here's a neat little trick. I can select on a material and say select objects assigned to, and I can see that it selected this object. So that is the material. So I could come in here and let's maybe change that number to be 10,000 also. Okay, so now it's just barely casting a little bit of a blue tint onto my dice. Okay, once I'm happy with that, now I can come in and let me go ahead and stop my render real quick. Well, actually, I'll keep that. I'll keep it rendering. I might zoom up and get the camera angle that I want. So I'm going to rotate so we don't see our light, our green light there anymore, and let it render a little bit. Now I'll come back and increase our ambient light. So this is what it looks like with no light whatsoever in the room coming from other light sources except for the green light and the blue light. If I crank this up a little bit, we're going to start introducing some sunlight into our room. So now we've got our green, our blue, and some of our sunlight or our ambient light in there. Maybe 700 is too much. Let's crank that down to like 500, for example. Okay. So hopefully you saw in this example where you can really define and focus where you want these lights. And I'm going to show you how to create those spotlights here in just a second. But what's neat about this is if you just do a standard render, let's say you've modeled this beautiful train, let's just say, you know, it's got hundreds of parts on it, and you hit render and it looks okay, but you can't see the detail like in where the wheels are or anything like that. You could create these custom lights that focus just on that particular area, for example, and illuminate it just, you know, 10%, 20%, and bring out that detail. Okay, so how do you add the emissive material to, like, for example, the spotlight? So I'm going to turn off our panel lights, and I'm going to turn on one of these point lights. And again, this is just a cylinder that's slightly tapered, really easy to create. And I just moved it in space. And again, I'll do my appearance. Let's do this LED. We'll do the green light again. But right here at the top is where we want to be very specific. Instead of doing it to the whole body, we want to go to a particular face. So I'm going to click on Faces. And let's just drag and drop onto this face right here. And you can see how it's turned green. So we just applied the emissive material just to that face. Okay. We'll crank our ambient light back down to 0. We'll hit in-canvas render. And we should see, barely, how that green light is casting just on those front faces. It's like we're shining a spotlight there. So again, I could come in and let's just edit, and let's just make that 100,000 in this case. And now you can really kind of see how that flashlight is highlighting those particular faces, but you don't see it in the background. And this is exactly how the person that created that tank type vehicle rendering where it was really dark. This is exactly how he did that. He just put it from the top pointing down, and you can see how you get that really nice fall off. I can change the color of the light. So we could come in here and say we want more of a blue light, and it's not gonna, unfortunately, not gonna update until I reapply it, I think. There we go. So let's add to faces, and I'll just apply it to that face. Hopefully it'll change the color. I can't remember. Yeah, I guess I have to copy it and duplicate it to do a new color. So, okay. So that's how you do the emissive material. So again, it's under miscellaneous, emissive, and you can see we have different like frosted bulbs, LED bulbs, etc. So here's a neat example. I mentioned this in my previous one of my previous live streams. We're remodeling our bathroom, and so I've modeled the whole thing inside of Fusion, and you know, I've got some reflective glass going on. You can kind of see that, and I even have some lights over here. And when we do the render, it actually does the light. Oops, does the light when we render. So let me rotate this back again. Let me just show you a couple of quick renders here. And the reason I modeled this is because we wanted to visualize what's it going to look like with the tile being vertical versus being horizontal. What if we did a different color tile over on this wall versus this wall? And here you can actually see the reflections of the lights in the tile. I haven't done the grout color yet, so disregard the really bright white. But you can see how the light is reflecting off the wall here. Let me go ahead and view this guy so you can kind of see the lights. You know, the mirrors are casting the shadows and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty neat. So, you know, here we did the tile horizontally and determined, you know, we kind of liked it vertically better, but I wouldn't have known that until we had rendered and simulated it. So we tried different kinds of tile. What would it look like with, you know, more of a tan tile, which we didn't like at all. And, you know, close up, you can actually see this is the actual granite tile. I just downloaded an image of the tile off of the company's webpage and applied that as a material. Okay, same thing with the floor. Just used the images from the tile company and simulated what the floor is going to look like. So, anyways, you know, the mosaics. I even have decals of the shampoo bottles and all that kind of stuff. So just, you know, kind of fun creating these realistic looking representations. Okay, let's jump back into the next tip is using HDRI images. And HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Images or imaging. And it basically expands the dynamic range of an image to show details in the darks, like the shadows, and also in the highlights. And this creates some really realistic looking representations. I don't know if you've ever seen the videos or pictures of like, you can see the Milky Way in the sky, but you can still see like the mountain and the trees. That's because they used HDRI. They used a high dynamic range, and they were able to pull the sharpness of the stars out, but also give enough light to see the mountains or the trees or whatever they're using in those images. So that's how they're doing that, is actually with HDRI. You can find free HDRI maps online, and this HDRI Haven is a really good one. I'm going to go ahead and click on the link. Let me just bring this over here real quick so you can see what this looks like. And you can see it's broken down into key areas like outdoor, skies, indoor, studios, etc. Now what's neat about this is you'll notice these 4 spheres in each of these pictures. They're the exact same material. So you'll notice there's like a glass, there's a white plastic, there's a metal, and there's like a shiny plastic. So notice how different these plastics look, for example, and the metals look just because of the image in the background. Okay? So, for example, if we were doing our food processor or something like that, I might want to do like an indoor type setting. So something that looked more like a kitchen or something like that. So, you know, here's an interior of a house. And this is what would reflect on the glass and the plastics of my object. So, and you can search, you know, you could search for living room, you could search for kitchen, you could search for bathroom or whatever. And you just download any of these. So, for example, I like this one. Click on it, and you can see gives you an example of what that would look like. And then you can download them. And I recommend the 4K. So we'll just go ahead and download that. I'll let that, and it's done. It's basically that quick. We can now use that in our rendering. So let me show you how to do that real quick. I'm going to jump back into Fusion. I'll turn my ambient light back up a little bit. And let's turn off our point light. And I'm going to go to my environment library. So here is where you can specify your different lighting. So for example, rim highlights. I'm going to grab and drag that in here. And now it's illuminating the room with these rim highlights. If I do sharp highlights, you can see how it's almost using like an umbrella light. And it's going to change, you know, how sharp it is in this scene. So here's rim. You can see how it's kind of muted. However, sharp is really reflecting some light off those top faces. Well, right here, attach custom environment. Well, we just downloaded this Lithwood room, so let's just go ahead and bring that and say open. And it takes a little while to bring in because it's a pretty large image, but now you can see that it's actually using this image to reflect onto our dice. So instead of a very white looking dice, we've now got kind of this cream colored dice, and that's because this is what's reflecting on the dice. Okay, now obviously I would not render the environment, but you can kind of see how my dice look kind of orange right now, or beige. If I change that, and let's pick a different one, let's do, for example, this one here, we'll see that it's going to change to be a much darker image, and that's because it's a kind of like an outdoor environment. You can kind of see like a city scene or whatever, so the grays are what's reflecting on it. Now, I recommend using the HDRI images because it just adds a little bit more realism to it. So for example, notice this hangar image down here. If I were modeling like a car or something like that, an airplane, I would probably use an environment like this because these skylights would reflect off of those sharp edges and those, you know, curved edges and the glass and stuff like that. I wouldn't use this one here because typically you wouldn't have a car inside your house, for example. So use an environment that kind of makes sense. Okay. So here's some examples, and you've already kind of seen this. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I just created a bunch of spheres with different materials: aluminum, anodized aluminum, glass, 3 different plastics, gold, and marble. And notice how you can actually see the lights reflecting in some of these materials. Okay. Here I used a cloudy sky outdoor material, and notice how different these materials look now. So if I come back here, you know, notice the glass. I come over here and notice what it looks like here, for example. So I'm just going to kind of cruise through. Here's another outdoor scene. But I really like how some of these, like the white plastic looks, and you know, some of these other plastics I think look really good. Here's the apartment. Notice how orange or tan or whatever color you want to call it look. But I think the plastics look a little bit more realistic now. We can kind of see how stuff's reflecting off of them. But my aluminum I don't think looks great at all. So I probably wouldn't use this one if my part had a lot of metal or aluminum to it. Here's a loft. We can see again the skylights are really emphasized on the plastics. But probably my favorite is this white plastic. If I had a lot of plastics in my design, I'd probably use something like this, especially if it was an indoor object, such as a coffee maker, you know, or a toaster or something like that. Okay, then again, Lake HDRI, we can kind of see what that looks like. Looks more realistic in the metals, I think. So I might use something like this for my metallic type objects. Okay. My next tip, we're getting near the end here, so bear with me. I know we're going kind of long on this one. Seamless textures. Definitely use seamless textures, okay? It basically allows you to scale up or scale down your texture without seeing the seams. Now, obviously in this image here, this is not a seamless texture, so you can really kind of see the edges, and it looks awful, okay? Seamless textures are great for like marbles, wood, brick, stone, flooring, etc. And again, just do a search for seamless textures. So let me show you an example. This is the exact same object, exact same material, but I was able to scale it up or down because it's a seamless texture. You don't see those seams anymore. Okay, so again, just showing this really quick. If I go out to Google and I just do a search for seamless brick texture or something like that. Oops, I spell it right. So I'll go to images. And again, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but let's just pick on this one. You'll notice there's a very small brick right here, but that would tie into this brick over here. So you could repeat this over and over and over again, and you wouldn't see the pattern. So same thing with like this image right here. This rock is seamless with this one over here. And again, you can do this with anything. So, you know, flooring texture. So you'd want to, you know, if you had some kind of a flooring, you'd want it to be seamless, for example. Okay. Texture map controls. This allows you to orient textures that have grain, such as like, for example, carbon fiber, wood, stone, etc. By default, Fusion uses the automatic texture map projection, and it doesn't work in all situations. So let me give you an example. This is set to automatic, and it looks pretty good. However, we can see kind of a sharp transition right here. You kind of see a seam, for example. It still looks like carbon fiber, but I want it to be more realistic than this. So you can change your projection type from automatic to, for example, planar. Now that got rid of that seam, but notice what it did across the top. It has to stretch across this top, and that does not look good. Okay, it makes the side look good, but it does not make the top look good. Then there's box, and box basically is applied on all 6 faces. So, you know, you'll see there's a material here from the top, from the side, from the bottom, left and right, and you'd actually have control over each of those planes individually if you wanted to. It typically creates more realistic results, but again, in this case, I can kind of see just a little bit of a zigzag or something going on here. It's not bad, but I still kind of see an edge. Spherical obviously does not work in this case. It is usually reserved for spherical type objects. Cylindrical, notice in this case, gave us the most realistic result. So we see the grain going all the way around. It's not being stretched out. It's actually coming over this little finger or thumb bump right here and all that kind of stuff. It looks really good. So instead of automatic, cylindrical makes the most sense in this case. Okay. Okay, wrapping things up, some terms that you might hear. Global illumination, HDRI, you've already heard about. Depth of field. dielectric priority, and alpha channel. So let me just talk about these. So global illumination is this process that simulates indirect lighting. So in my example here, I created a white room and I put a red ball in the corner. And it might be kind of hard to see on the shared window, but you'll see a little bit of pink reflecting on these walls. Well, the walls aren't reflective, okay? It's actually the light photons bouncing off this and actually casting a little bit of a pink hue onto the wall. And this is called global illumination. It creates much more realistic looking renders, and Fusion does it for you automatically. In some other systems, you might actually have to turn this option on. HDRI, we've talked about that. It creates a more realistic rendering. They usually take longer to render, unfortunately, but it gives you a more realistic rendering. And here's a prime example. I just took this image here and wrapped it on the sphere, and it almost looks like a UFO sphere hovering over the railroad tracks. This rendering probably took 20 seconds to put together, and it looks pretty realistic. Okay, depth of field. I've mentioned this multiple times. In that Toy Story slide that we showed, I mentioned the depth of field. It basically allows you to specify the distance between the nearest and further objects that give an image judged to be in focus on a camera. So it's actually simulating how an actual camera would work. So in this knife example that I created, right here is the center focal point. So you'll notice things that are far away are kind of blurry, and things that are kind of close up are kind of blurry. Okay, and you can do this inside of Fusion. So for example, I'm going to turn on my background again. Right here is depth of field. So I'm going to go ahead and render this without it. So we'll do the fast render. So I'll click on this. We can kind of see what that looks like. Let's just crank this up slightly. Give us a little bit more light. Okay, and then I'm going to turn on depth of field. And watch what happens. So this dice here is very blurry. In fact, most of my background is really blurry. And you can see this little green dot right here. That is our center of focus. So if I were to select, for example, maybe this front dice right here, we're going to see that this back dice gets very, very blurry. And again, I'm using this quick render just so we can see what that looks like. Still pretty blurry, so we're going to change our intensity of the blur. So I'm going to crank this down quite a bit. Let's just go down to like 0.2. And now we can see my back dice is still blurry, but not as much. In fact, let's just try 0.1. And that'll give us, really sharp front dice and a slightly blurred back dice. So that is the depth of field option, okay? So if you ever render and your image turns out blurry, it's because of the depth of field. Dielectric priority. This is kind of the advanced part of rendering, but allows you to specify the priority of semi-transparent materials to give you a more realistic rendering. So, for example, I created these glasses here. You'll notice that there's, some bourbon or something like that inside the glasses with some ice cubes. But you can see the ice cubes through the bourbon. Well, believe it or not, this bourbon is just a cylinder. It's a solid cylinder object. Okay? So if I were to hit render normally, that would block out all of my other objects like the ice and the air bubbles, etc. So you can specify the priority of how things are rendered. And the next slide kind of explains this a little bit better. Okay? So for example, we obviously want to be able to see through the glass. So that's probably the highest priority. Then I want to be able to see through the ice and the bubbles. So that's going to be the second priority. And then finally, I want to be able to see through the bourbon. So that's the least priority, or number 3. Okay. And again, here's another rendering. Notice, once again, depth of field. Also notice the background isn't just a plain gray background. They spend a little bit of time creating a nice environment in the background. So to give it a little bit more liveliness. You can see the reflections on the floor or the table here. But that's what dielectric priority does. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you just basically right-click on the body or component, and you can specify the dielectric priority control. And then lastly, alpha channel. This allows you to create a transparent background, which then allows you to place the rendering over another image. So for example, I rendered the knife again, but I used an alpha channel, and then I just brought it into a paint program like Photoshop or GIMP or whatever product you want to use. And because the knife had an alpha channel, it basically allows the other image to show through. So this would be a prime example. Like for example, let's say you've been asked to model a sign for a company, and you've modeled the whole thing in Fusion and all that kind of stuff, and you can actually render it. You could take a picture of the building that the sign is going to go on and actually position your rendering to be on top of the photograph. And so you could show your client what that sign is going to look like even before they purchase the actual product. So kind of cool way to use the rendering. And again, kind of like I showed with the bathroom, we can visualize what is this bathroom going to look like. Do we want the tile vertically? Do we want it horizontally? How many tile do we need to buy? All that kind of stuff. So let me see where we're at. So yep, that is the end of my presentation. Let me just look through the chat window. I apologize, I hardly ever have time to look through the chat window. Okay, so Steve, thanks for the comment. He said, the more I see Fusion 360, the more impressed I am. Yeah, again, I apologize if there was a lag. It looks like there might have been a little bit of a lag when I was rendering. So again, thank you for attending. Please, if you have any ideas, I noticed some people posted some ideas in the chat. I am keeping a long list of topics that people want to see. I'm adding those ideas to the list. So if I don't do a cam live stream, tomorrow, for example, it's not that I'm ignoring you. I'm just adding it to the list. I have lots of topics I want to share with you. Again, I appreciate the positive comments about what you're seeing Fusion can do, and these tips and tricks that I'm sharing with you are being useful for you. So I do appreciate the feedback. Definitely make sure you've subscribed. Also, if you hit the little bell icon, it'll notify you when the next live stream is happening. So with that, again, thank you, and have a good rest of your day.